Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I have Ed Bryant here. He's the president and CEO of Sanford Advisors. That's an M&A advisory firm for US and Canadian mid-market tech companies. Ed has about 25 years of experience, and during that time, he's raised over $20 billion in equity and debt capital and completed over $10 billion in M&A transactions. So, Ed, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for having me.
So, Ed, I've had the great fortune of working with tech startups that recognize the importance of implementing privacy into the design of their products and services. And they recognize the importance of compliance with privacy regulations, the importance of building trust with their users. And certainly, for those who want to be acquired, they certainly understand that they need to implement privacy as part of their due diligence. Unfortunately, though, there are startups that might not recognize the importance of having a proper privacy hygiene prior to acquisition and the negative impact their privacy risks may have on a potential sale. So, I wanted to pick your brain, but just before I do so, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So I've lived in Canada for about 8 years now. I came here from New York, where I was an investment banker doing tech, media, telecom investment banking. And I came here to join a technology company and for a little bit of a simpler life than what New York presents. And in my role in that technology company as VP of M&A and then CFO, I realized that there was a bit of a gap in the Canadian market. There wasn't anyone that just focused on M&A for technology companies. And so just over 5 years ago, I set up Sanford Advisors, and that's all we do. We don't do capital raises or take companies public or anything else. We're purely just doing mergers and acquisitions for technology companies, and we're very focused on the mid-market. So we're not trying to do billion-dollar deals or anything like that. We're really focused on technology companies that are going to exit for between kind of 10 and $150 million.
It's pretty good. Awesome. Okay, so thank you again for joining us. And I want to first focus on the buyer side. So, when you are representing a buyer, what are some privacy considerations that a buyer will look out for before acquiring a business?
Yeah, and I think this has been a really evolving situation. I would say like 10 years ago, no one really looked at this at all. It really wasn't an important consideration in transaction. And more recently, with a lot of the different legislation that's been introduced globally, we're seeing more and more buyers really get focused on like privacy and adherence. So I would say like buyers are really looking for, is there a strong privacy policy? And is it adhered to and tested in a way that can prove that it actually adheres to that kind of standard or whatever. So, but it's been an interesting and very dynamic space because yeah, like I said, a few years ago, no one really cared about it. But with introductions like in Canada, in Europe of new legislation, I think buyers are getting much more aware of it and being much more cautious about it as well. So.
Okay, so there you pointed at a few things that I want to dive a little bit deeper into. You talked about you look for a privacy policy. So does it raise a red flag with you when you're looking at a privacy policy and you notice that it was drafted like a week or a month before you started the negotiations?
I think it definitely does. I think with any sort of, the due diligence process in an M&A deal is pretty insane. Like the depth that the buyer goes to in terms of just picking through every single document, every single contract, every single agreement, whatever it may be. And there are some things that you can create at the last minute, like minute books, which no one ever updates, which get updated at the last minute. But there's certain things that raise red flags if they haven't had them, right? And so we're always very conscious in general of like, is there things that the company should have that they don't have?
Yeah.
And it does raise a red flag if it's 3 days before signing an offer to go into an exclusivity period with a buyer that the privacy policy was created or whatever. So I would say it's obviously much better to have one in place way before an acquisition, like a lot of the other stuff that business owners don't do before an acquisition as well. So
You also talked about adherence to the privacy policy. And so, are you only looking at the privacy policy in the words on the paper and making sure that you're comfortable with what's on it? Or are you actually diving deeper and looking into whether the business is actually implementing what they preach or what they say they're going to do? So, how deep do you look? That's number one. And then number two, when you talk about doing the due diligence, who's the one doing the due diligence? Is it the buyer? Is the buyer requesting that the seller do a self due diligence, or maybe do you hire a third company to do that for you?
yeah, it's a good question. So I would say they're going deeper and deeper. The buyers are right now. So it's usually the buyer that's doing the due diligence. They sometimes hire outside consultants to do it, or that, if they're private equity or a bigger company that has experts in-house, they'll do a lot of this stuff in-house.
Yeah.
But in reality, like, it's not just looking at the policy and saying, okay, yes, they've got a policy, check. It's, it's either their in-house counsel or their external counsel, the buyer on the buyer side, really looking at the policy. Does it cover all the things that it needs to cover? And then is it implemented, right? And so it's kind of like almost like an employee handbook. You could have an employee handbook about how great your culture is and that sort of stuff. But if you don't adhere to it, and there's bad behavior or whatever, the buyers are gonna not just look at the policy and say, okay, you had a policy, right? So it's really about adherence across the board with any of this sort of stuff, and then is the right sort of topics covered in that policy as well.
Okay. And speaking about topics, one of the hot topics these days is cross-border data transfers. So where a company is collecting data, for example, from the EU, which is now, what everyone's kind of talking about with the
Right.
GDPR. So when a buyer is looking at a prospective acquisition, do they consider where the business is collecting their data from and what their data handling practices are as it relates to cross-border data transfers?
That's a great question. I think they absolutely do, especially given GDPR, right? I think when that came in a few years back, that really changed the game in terms of what people were concerned about, because I think any buyer is concerned, like, are they buying a business that has a lot of problems or skeletons in the closet, and what's the penalties of those skeletons, right? And historically, there wasn't much penalty to it, and in Europe, the penalties are pretty extreme, right, in terms of like non-adherence to their privacy policies. So I think it's become more of an issue because of GDPR for sure, and like they are definitely, buyers in particular are focused on, where is the information coming from, and are you adhering to that particular jurisdiction's rules and practices and everything. So
yeah, I mean, I would also imagine that the buyer is thinking whether they would have to adhere to certain provisions within the GDPR themselves. If they are now the collector or the custodian of that data, they themselves have to make sure that they are GDPR compliant.
yes, that's right. And in reality, like, what most buyers do on this sort of stuff is they transfer the risk to the seller. So when you're selling a company, there's a big document, a share purchase agreement, which goes with the sale. And then there's a lot of what's called reps and warranties. So representations of warranties that you're making as a seller, that you're adhering to certain things, that you're not getting sued or whatever it might be. And there's different reps and warranties in there. And on privacy, what we've seen recently is this attempt by the buyer to do what's called a blanket rep. So a blanket rep is basically, you are not breaching any other country's privacy policies, which is pretty broad, right? Which, as a small company or a small technology company, you might not know if you're breaching some policy in Cambodia or wherever it might be, right? So,
Or even in the US, like
or
state
even in the
by state,
US,
it
right?
all is so different. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So what we try to do as advisors and sellers, and the sellers legal counsel will try to do, is try to narrow that down to what's called a knowledge qualifier. So to our knowledge, we do not breach, which is obviously much better because it protects the seller. But what we have seen in recent cases is the buyers really pushing for that much broader rep. And what that rep does is, if you breach that rep, you could end up as a seller owing the buyer money basically post the deal. So if the European Union comes after them for a breach of GDPR, they're going to come knock on the seller's door to be compensated for any fines or penalties that they have. So there is a real risk here as a seller for either non-compliance or not really treating this issue as importantly as it is. So
Right. So the buyer is transferring the risk back to the seller.
yes, or there's always a bit of a give and take between both sides, right? And try to get to like what's market terms. But I think on privacy in particular, market is shifting a little bit, and buyers are becoming a little bit more cautious about it and what the ramifications of it could be.
Okay. Now, so we talked a lot about from a buyer perspective, and I just want to turn the table a little bit. As an advisor for tech startups, from a privacy perspective, is there anything that you would advise your clients to do, the tech startup, prior to negotiating an acquisition?
I think it's the same advice we give, but kind of across the board. Like, are you ready to do M&A? Like M&A is very complicated, and the diligence, like we touched on earlier, is extreme. Like I always warn my clients before they go into this process that you, at some point in the process, the diligence process, you're going to call me and say, you just throw your hands up, I'm done. And so what we try to do beforehand is like, are you prepared? Have you done everything? Like, what are the red flags? What are the questions that are going to come up? And I think it's just being prepared, right? Like, yeah, do you have a privacy policy in place? Do you adhere to it? Particularly focus on jurisdictions where there's pretty heavy risk or penalties that could go with it, like Europe. And is there any issues there that need to be resolved before you get into this? Because they will get uncovered. Like all issues get uncovered during the due diligence process. So you might as well talk about them up front, figure them out up front, and make sure you have a solution up front, right, rather than at the last minute it becoming a big issue and potentially jeopardizing the transaction.
Okay, so try to implement a privacy program well in advance of any negotiations for M&A. And what we heard from you before is you don't want to do this a week or even a month before, because that's going to raise a red flag that you don't actually have anything in place, but you're just kind of putting a Band-Aid over a wound in hopes that no one will recognize that. So we're gonna kind of switch gears a little bit again. And here's the question. So do buyers usually ask for a customer or an employee list from the seller, where now the seller has to disclose this information, which includes personal information about customers or employees? And if so, in what format is that usually provided to the buyer?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And yes, they always require both. So before closing, the buyer wants to see a full customer list, and usually like revenue by customer is the most important thing that they're looking at over several years of things. They're also looking for the actual customer agreement. They always look at, like, especially for bigger customers, what does that agreement look like? Is there any risk in the agreement? That sort of stuff. On the employee side, they also want like a full listing of employees, what their titles are, what their salaries are, bonuses, that sort of stuff that they've received. So they can really figure out, like, by department, what the costs are in each department and what the structure of the organization is like. What we do is we hold that back as long as possible, basically, in a process. So that's the kind of protection that we kind of take. So we will release a no names customer list with revenue by year, by customer one, customer two, etc. And then on the employee side, we'll do the same thing: employee one, employee two, and the salaries, the titles, that sort of stuff. So we're trying to hold back the name and any sort of personal information as long as possible. But ultimately, when we're 2 or 3 weeks away from closing a transaction, then we'll release the actual customer names and the employee names. But when we feel really comfortable that we're going to actually close the deal, like if there's any risk, we won't release any of that information. And some of that's privacy related, but also it's competitive competitive data as well that you don't want in a potential competitor's hands. So that's the way we approach it. But I'd love to hear, Sharon, if you have any suggestions of what else to kind of consider here.
Yeah. I mean, I would say you want to try to minimize as much of the personal information that you're disclosing to only what is absolutely necessary. So thinking about why a potential buyer may need a specific data field is necessary. Making sure that you don't just disclose everything is a good idea. You want to redact as much as you can without compromising the negotiation or the acquisition. You want to make sure that you have an NDA in place. You also want to make sure that if the acquisition doesn't actually go through, so what does the buyer do with this personal information that you've disclosed to them? Do they have proper security measures to discard or to delete the data that they now have in their possession?
Yeah.
And then it's always good practice to include in your privacy policy that you might disclose personal information in the event of an acquisition or to your subsidiary or affiliated entity. So that might be a good idea to put in place and to protect yourself.
Cool. Well, that's much more comprehensive than my answer.
Well, Ed, I just wanted to thank you so much. I think that this is really going to be very helpful to so many people. I know it certainly was helpful to me. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll hear from you again on a different topic that is somewhat related to mergers and acquisitions as well as to privacy. So thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me, Sharon. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.